Tonight, the Jefferson Literary and Debating Society, now in its 187th year of perpetual existence, is both pleased and proud to present its fourth speaker in the weekly speaker series for the spring semester of 2012, Mr. Richard Leahy. Mr. Leahy will present a speech entitled Beyond Jefferson's Vines. Mr. Leahy has been writing about wine, especially Virginia wine, for consumers and producers since 1986. He was a regional editor of Kevin Zraly's American Wine Guide and was Mid-Atlantic and Southern editor for the Oxford Companion to the Wines of North America. He was East Coast editor of Vineyard and Winery Management for 10 years and coordinates the seminar program for the Eastern Winery Exposition taking place in March in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Mr. Leahy is a member of the Society of Wine Educators, the Circle of Wine Writers, and on the board of DrinkLocalWine.com. Mr. Leahy has a website and blog focused on wines of the East at richardleahy.com. He's a UVA alumnus, graduating from the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences in 1991, as well as having received the Jefferson Society's Best Debate Award in that same year. He is also the author of the upcoming book, Beyond Jefferson's Vines, on the evolution of quality wine in Virginia, of which the Detroit News said, nobody has a better grip on the history and modern Virginia wine industry than Richard Leahy, who brings a lifetime of studying and tasting wine and living in the heart of the Virginia wine country to this project. The Jefferson Society is indeed honored to host such a distinguished individual this evening. Please stand and join me in welcoming Mr. Richard Leahy.
It's a distinct honor and privilege to be with you here today. It's been many years, probably since before any of you could understand what Jefferson meant to anything, but it's great to see so many alert, bright faces here today, and I'm also happy to see there's much more of a gender balance in the society than there was when I was here. Yes. Mr. Wizard, can I have a bottle of water, please? And the tie is a little disheveled because I'm waiting for the whole time for the society to arrive. I was going to demonstrate that, which I think that any hall member who comes back to address the audience should use it. So, Jefferson's wines. Beyond Jefferson's Vines refers to the vineyard he planted at Monticello. Many of you have heard of that. A lot of people seem to think that Jefferson was the father of Virginia wine. I'll read some parts of the book tonight to show that's not the case. And so the title comes from the fact that the cultivation of wine in Virginia began before Jefferson, continued after him, and in the last decade, I'm happy to say that we have achieved recognition as a world-class wine region, that is Virginia has, realizing Thomas Jefferson's dream 200 years after his second administration. So the book talks about the history, talks about Jefferson's involvement, brings to light some new discoveries about Virginia wine which we didn't know from the 1700s. Most of the book is a travel log throughout Virginia wine country, starting in the east, on the eastern shore, going all the way to the west, up and down the Piedmont. And as you can see, there's a website, beyondjeffersonsvines.com, where information will be available about the book. I will now give to the Vice President, if anyone is interested, a sign-up sheet for anyone who wants to, interested in getting autographed copies, for which there will be no extra charge. The book is $19.99, but these books will be available in Charlottesville by the end of March, early April, and I will, in addition to the price of the book, only charge shipping to give you an autographed copy from. I think all members deserve that distinction. So, I will read the introduction in a couple of chapters that talk about the context of Virginia wine. Most of the book, as I say, is visiting individual wineries around the state and the wine regions, but I'll leave that to you on your own. I want to give you some background now. We're going to start in the present, move back to the past, and then come back to the present, beginning and ending at Monticello. It was a beautiful sunny day in early September 2010 in the orchard at Monticello, home of Thomas Jefferson. The heavy humidity usual for late summer was gone, and it felt more like early fall. In the shade of fruit trees, 10 members of the prestigious Circle of Wine Writers sat at 2 cloth-covered picnic tables and served themselves salad and chicken with penne. The tables had been set up where the orchard meets the vineyard, and the table legs had to be leveled on the slope of the hill but it provided a most charming bucolic setting and a very appropriate one for a talk about Thomas Jefferson and his vines. The vines the writers could view from their table had, like all the other plants mentioned in Jefferson's garden book, been painstakingly replanted in their original positions. Gabriele Rossi, Assistant Director of Gardens and Grounds, had researched the names of 18th century grape varieties Jefferson had imported through his friend, the patriot and native Italian Filippo Mazzi. The grapevines are trained as they would have been 200 years ago on split rail fencing, but with an important difference. The vines are not grafted on American rootstock, standard practice in nearly all wine regions in the world today, to avoid the phylloxera vine louse that helped doom Jefferson's efforts in viticulture. Planting grapevines on phylloxera and disease-resistant rootstock is now a major part of viticultural success in Virginia compared to Jefferson's time. Rossi has a small winery of his own where he processes the grapes harvested from the Monticello vineyard and makes them into a traditional Chianti-style blend dominated by the Sangiovese grape, but also containing the white Trebbiano. I learned the reason why the Tuscans blended the two grapes together. Sangiovese is a high acid grape that also has high pH, explained Rossi, which makes it problematic to achieve stability in the finished wine. Trebbiano has good acidity with lower pH, so in blending them, it corrects the pH and makes a more stable wine. Now, the writers were able to enjoy this contemporary blend of the errors of Jefferson's vines, a dark rosé colored wine, fresh and lively, with bright, snappy cherry flavors and acidity and low tannin. Perfect wine for an alfresco Italian lunch on a gorgeous late summer day. Thomas Jefferson, who drafted the Declaration of Independence, founded the University of Virginia, and wrote the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, was also the third president of the United States, was the father of American wine. As he wrote to Thomas Appleton from Monticello in 1816, he considered wine a necessary of life. Not content to merely import the best wines from Europe, he was also one of the first to have them bottled at the chateau. He also believed in the potential of American viticulture for producing both quality wine and prosperity for the American farmer. In a letter to John Doherty in 1881, Jefferson wrote, "Wine being among the earliest luxuries in which we indulge ourselves, it is desirable that it should be made here, and we have every soil, aspect, and climate of the best wine countries. And I have myself drank wines made in the state and in Maryland of the quality of the best Burgundy." Jefferson's first plantings of grapevines at Monticello were made in 1771. Arriving in 1773, Filippo Mazzi was happy to help Jefferson establish a European-style vineyard at Monticello and another in a nearby farm called Colley, site of today's Jefferson vineyards. Unfortunately, Jefferson never harvested a crop from his vineyard. Conventional wisdom blames the phylloxera vine louse, fungal disease, and winter injury for this failure. The Colley vineyard, planted by Mazzi's vignerons, having survived several years, was leased by Mazzi to General Regal, whose horses in 1 week destroyed the whole labor of 3 or 4 years and thus ended an experiment, Jefferson wrote to Senator Albert Gallatin in 1793, which from every appearance would in a year or two more have established the practicality of that branch of culture in America. Jefferson believed it would be well to push the culture of native grapes, as it would take centuries for European grapes to adapt to our soil and climate. We could, he prophetically declared in an 1808 letter to Count C.P. de Lastillerie, in the United States, make as great a variety of wines as are made in Europe. Not exactly the same kinds, but doubtless as good. Planting European grapevines on their own roots, as Jefferson and Mazzi did, proved to be unsuitable for commercial viticulture in Virginia. But how long did Jefferson's vines last? We know that vines planted in Jamestown and later in the 18th century survived long enough to produce accidental hybrids with American grapes, so phylloxera and fungal disease might not have wiped them out for some time. A more intriguing question is, what happened to the grapes on Jefferson's vines? Rossi has spent time reading the letters between Jefferson and his estate managers in an attempt to determine if grapes were ripened in the vineyard. That Mazzi planted. Although Monticello officials tell us wine was never made from grapes on the estate, and Jefferson was a meticulous record keeper, as well as an enthusiastic gardener and wine lover, he would certainly have documented the event. Rosset disputes the popular notion that the vines were destroyed by phylloxera, fungal disease, or other threats before they could produce fruit. In one letter of February 8, 1786, answering Jefferson's inquiry on the progress of his vineyard, Antonio Gianni, the farm manager at first, says the vines are improving marvelously, but then explains that the reason no wine had been made is, quote, because each year the grapes are taken before they are ripe, which is very harmful to the vines. Quotes Rosset, taken by whom? Certainly correct picking instructions were given, but what if the grapes were already gone before picking could begin? This tantalizing bit of evidence suggests that the birds were the primary culprit, if not the deer or other animals. And this makes sense. The European vinifera grapes were also sweeter and less bitter than the small, berry-sized grapes from native varieties like Vitis riparia that grow wild in the woods at Monticello today. Gianni also seems to be shrewdly covering himself in case Jefferson returned to find devastation in the vineyard. It was suggested that some people were stealing the grapes, says Rosset. If they had, they would not have done it year after year for fear of being caught. The first vineyards were planted in 1771, and a letter from Gianni is dated in 1786. The vines obviously survived and matured, but whether they produced a crop that was not preyed on by animals or fungal diseases is a different matter, as all grape growers today know. Deer fences, which have to be at least 10 feet tall to discourage deer from jumping over them, are now common in commercial vineyards in the East, even though it can cost up to $10,000 to protect 10 acres of vines with the fencing. If Jefferson hadn't spent so much time away from his beloved Monticello, he might have noticed his delectable ripening grape crop suddenly disappeared, which to his rational mind would suggest they're being eaten by wildlife. He might then have employed scarecrows or other tactics, including hunting, to increase the chances of the grapes reaching ripeness, being harvested, and being made into fine table wine. Although Jefferson never lived to see a crop harvested from his own vines, his optimism about the future of American viticulture was not ill-founded. About the time he died, Dr. Daniel Norton pioneered Norton's Virginia seedling grapes, now simply known as Norton or Cynthiana in Arkansas, upon which a successful commercial grape and wine industry was built in Virginia and Missouri in the 19th century. At the same time, American grapes like Concord and Catawba created booming native wine industries from New York to the Carolinas. Unfortunately, Prohibition all but killed the American wine industry. It was barely kept alive by the exemption to the Volstead Act allowing home wine production and consumption, and the making of sacramental wine, leading to occasional scandals involving rabbis with non-Jewish surnames trying to claim a sacramental exemption. Repeal occurred during Depression, a bad time to invest in vineyards or wineries. Those looking for faster return on investment in alcoholic beverages made beer or liquor. While the California wine industry recovered, the loss of craft knowledge in the East was devastating. With the challenge of high humidity and fungal diseases, not to mention animal depredation, it would take decades for the industry to branch beyond industrial giants making branded wine out of native grapes for an unsophisticated market. This book tells the story of what has happened to Jefferson's vines in his native Virginia, focusing on the last 30 years, but also shedding light on previously unexamined chapters of the 18th century Virginia wine experiment and demonstrating that Jefferson was following in the footsteps of many American colonists in trying to make fine wine in Virginia. The story encompasses many people in many fields: university researchers, grape growers, winemakers, and winery owners, politicians, marketing professionals, the media, and many others, all players in an industry persevering in the attempt to make not just wine, but fine wine that will restore Virginia's reputation as an important American wine region. Every one of them is striving to validate Jefferson's viticultural ambition by saying, in effect, Mr. Jefferson, here are your vines and wines, and they're doing very well today. The historic roots of Virginia wine. The history of Virginia wine industry to date has 5 distinct phases. Its beginning in the 17th century, the 18th century, and Thomas Jefferson's untimely failed experiments at Monticello, with recent discoveries on that era, the rise of the native wine industry based on the Norton grape in the 19th century, the industry's very slow return to health in the 20th century after its obliteration in Prohibition, and the rapid rise in wine quality, stylistic distinction, and international recognition in the first decade of the 21st century. The 17th century Virginia wine, its tentative beginning. As the leading American wine historian Thomas Penny explains in Volume 1 of his seminal work, A History of Wine in America, when the Jamestown settlement was established by the Virginia Company in 1607, a primary motivation was to make profit for its shareholders through supplying what was unavailable to English merchants due to various wars, olive oil, silk, and wine. However, starvation and hostile relations with the Indians stalled any commercial development of the colony until reinforcements and new administrators arrived in 1619. By then, the Virginia Company had been taken over by the Crown, which brought a number of changes, including the first elected assembly in the New World. Although the Virginia Company had gone to some trouble to pay for European grapevines and vignerons, that is, wine tenders, to tend to them, the colonists had discovered tobacco and the profits that addiction and fashion could bring to those who sold it, a reality that has continued to the present day. Tobacco is also a native Virginia plant, whereas the imported Vitis vinifera is native to a semi-arid Mediterranean climate and is very susceptible to fungal diseases and has no resistance to the indigenous vine louse phylloxera, which other American grapevine species have adapted to. Even if the vines had been impervious to these threats, tobacco has other advantages. Grapevines, unlike tobacco, require 3 years to yield their first small crop, and grapes are a favorite food of all manner of American fauna, from birds and bears to deer and raccoons. The return on investment for colonists on annual tobacco seed cultivation, compared to the highly risky and delicate perennial grapevines, made it a no-brainer to favor tobacco and its far more certain profits. On top of this, since the cooling of the European climate in the 14th century, the English no longer had any culture of vine cultivation. Unlike the Latin countries in warmer climates, it was far cheaper and more reliable to brew beer and later to distill corn, wheat, rye, and barley into whiskey. Accordingly, despite stern remonstrations from London to focus solely on grapevine cultivation, colonists thousands of miles away did as they pleased, doing no favor for Virginia viticulture and setting a precedent for transatlantic relations that would result in war some 160 years later, as they pursued what we might call today the quick buck. Act 12 of the Jamestown Assembly in 1619, commemorated in a Chardonnay of that name from Williamsburg Winery, shows both London's determination to yield wine from its colony and the fact that the colonists needed strong motivation if they were to plant vines. The law provided that every male household should cultivate 20 imported vinifera, i.e. European grapevines, adding that a punishment to be determined by the governor would be the penalty for failure to comply. While documentary evidence exists for commercial vineyards having been established in the Tidewater region at that time, they soon vanished from the 17th century record due to negligence, natural pests, and the lure of quick profits from tobacco cultivation. The 18th century, Jefferson's experiments and recent discoveries. Thomas Jefferson's viticultural experiments at Monticello and Cully have been well documented, as have the Virginia colonists' continued dogged attempts at viticulture through the 18th century. Interestingly, in the last few years, some missing chapters of 18th century Virginia wine history have come to light. While reading the first volume of Penny's Definitive History of American Viticulture, Michael Bowles of Montemain Cellars in Carter's Bridge noticed a reference to a manuscript that piqued his interest, a sketch of vine culture for Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas, written by Robert Bowling Jr. in 1774. At the time of the Revolution, the tobacco-based agrarian economy of colonial Virginia was in an economic slump. Bowling planted a vineyard in Buckingham County, and in this sketch urged his fellow Virginians to abandon tobacco and replace it with wine grapes. Part of what made this work intriguing was what it might reveal on the subject of wine in the 18th century. But Bowles also knew his family history and therefore knew that Bowling was an ancient ancestor, a distant ancestor of his. So he took an interest in the work out of both personal and professional curiosity. He traced the manuscript to the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, bought a microfilm copy, and had it transcribed via software. He later used the sketch as the basis for a class he taught at the engineering school at the University of Virginia. Bowles' family had been farming in Albemarle County since the 18th century. The original Montemain Vineyard, south of Charlottesville near Carter's Bridge, was one of the early and renowned Virginia wineries that stood out in the 1980s, when only a handful of wineries were producing anything quality-driven. In its 1985 vintage Chardonnay was served at a state dinner at the first Bush White House. And by the late 1980s, his Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon Reserve were consistently considered among the best in the state. A retired airline pilot, Michael Bowles' frequent European travels gave him appreciation for fine wine, and he could be energetic and animated while discussing his favorite topic. Bowling was very focused on the practicalities of viticulture, Bowles explains, over a glass of his own Chardonnay, looking out on the vines from which it was made. The first chapter is titled Profits, and Bowling describes, quote, certain diseases of the vine and some quackeries, as well as pruning and vine training at his own vineyard at what he called cello. He anticipated the umbrella Niffen system of training by 100 years, says Bowles. In early 1773, Bowling published an essay on the utility of vine planting in Virginia, in which he refers to the cultivation techniques used at the time in Madeira and Champagne as models. Unfortunately, Bowling died later the same year, but Bowles notes that Thomas Jefferson was his brother-in-law, and Bowling could therefore have had a major influence on Jefferson's vineyard experiments at Monticello and Colorado. His site selection was impeccable, says Bowles. He argued that if we planted grapevines, Virginia could solve its balance of payments problems with Britain. The sketch explains that Bowling had planted the vineyard at Cello, his Buckingham County estate on Mount Willis, where kyanite is now mined today. It is an excellent site for a vineyard on a well-drained, southeast-facing slope. Despite the paucity of documented survival of vineyards in the Commonwealth from the colonial era, Bowles maintains that Bowling wrote a sketch of the vine culture to encourage the Virginia gentry to plant wine grape vines, since there was a political backlash against tobacco in England at the time. Bowles says the Virginia Assembly awarded Bowling 50 pounds sterling to plant a vinifera vineyard at Cello. In 2009, Bowles taught a course titled A Curious History of Wine in Virginia, a Socio-Technical Systems Approach at UVA School of Engineering and Applied Science. My mission is to get a sketch of the vine culture published, declares Bowles, who already has approached University Press of Virginia. After being leased by Horton Vineyards for a time, the Montdomain label has resurfaced today. The wines are very old world style with minerality and delicate, vibrant fruit. The Chardonnay has a delicate touch of oak but firm acidity. The Viognier is not as fruit forward as most Virginia Viogniers, but has intriguing floral and mineral nuances. Meanwhile, Philip Carter Strother, who established the Philip Carter Vineyards in Rappahannock County in 2008, discovered fascinating documentation in the records of the Royal Society of Arts in London, showing that an ancestor named Charles Carter successfully raised grapes and made wine on his Virginia estate a decade before the appearance of Bowling's sketch in 1774. This overturns the belief that no evidence existed of successful grape and wine production in Virginia prior to the discovery of the Norton grape in the 1820s. Which will technical difficulty here. Okay, we're missing a couple pages, but basically what he found was that in the Virginia Assembly, one of the motions of the General Assembly was that, this was in 1762, they regretted that the expense and the trouble that Virginia colonists had to go to import wine into the colony, because the only wine worth drinking was wine that was either French and under very high tariffs because of the ongoing wars with Britain, or it was Madeira and port, which was under British control but was still very expensive to import this overseas. So, being practical Americans, they resolved that there should be some incentive for Virginians to attempt culture of the vine, and public-minded gentlemen put up prize money as a collection and incentive to inspire someone to plant vineyards and make wine that would then be acknowledgement that this could be done in Virginia. And The list includes many first families of Virginia, including Carters, Lees, Nelsons, and no less a person than George Washington. So there was a great deal of support for native Virginia wine industry from the best men in the colony at the time. One of the people who signed this document was, before the General Assembly, was Charles Carter himself, who then won the prize by producing 2 hogsheads, hogshead being a barrel, 55-gallon barrel, of 2 different kinds of grapes. One white from the Lisbon grape, which is a European variety, and the other they called the winter grape, which was some kind of a Native American grape or perhaps an American hybrid. And what was interesting was that this is so well documented because the Society of Fine Arts, the Royal Society of Fine Arts in London, sent over some inspectors to make sure that this was, and they came to his plantation, which was on the James River. And they inspected, they found that he had the vineyards, and they found the hogsheads of wine, and it would have not been possible to import barrels of table wine at that point, because table wine would have been so shaken up on the transatlantic voyage that it would have and oxidized, it would have gone bad. So they could tell it was wine made on the spot in situ, and they awarded him the prize money. And all of this is recorded by the Royal Society as well as by in the General Assembly notes. So Philip Strother says that this year is the, I think, 150th anniversary, 250th anniversary of this awarding of this prize. And so he's going to have a festival at the winery, as well as at the church where the Carter family has traditionally been organized around, Christ Church, and later, I think in May of this year. Some people in the industry are annoyed with the Philip Carter Winery slogan, "Before Jefferson, there was Carter." However, those recently discovered documents seem to prove that the marketing is based in fact. Both Strother and Bowling seem to be practicing Virginia viticulture as if it were a natural thing to do, and we owe the discovery of these missing chapters on Virginia wine to the great American wine historian Thomas Pitty and his sharp-eyed readers Michael Bowles and Philip Carter Strother. It remains a tantalizing mystery whether Jefferson was aware of Carter and Bowling's efforts or of Bowling's publication, and how it was that Carter was able to succeed in a way that was confirmed at the time where Jefferson's decades of patient efforts at limoncello seem to have failed. Was Carter aware of the threat of deer and birds to the ripening of the grapes? And what methods did he employ to ensure his crop ripened to maturity? How many years did his vineyard continue to produce a crop? What were the actual varieties planted in today's nomenclature? And were they hardier than the other vinifera varieties, or was he just a superior vineyard manager? We'll probably never know the answers to all these questions, but the new information unearthed by Bowles and Strother has given us a more complicated and tantalizing view of the 18th century in Virginia viticulture and winemaking history. The 19th century, Dr. Norton's Virginia seedling. Dr. Daniel Norton was a hobbyist gardener and grape hybridizer. Todd Kleiman tells of Norton's work and the spread of the grape that bears his name in his book, The Wild Vine. It is unclear whether Dr. Norton manually created the variety by physically hybridizing it, or whether hybridization was accidental to the cross-pollination in his garden with his many varieties. But we know he propagated the variety and after harvesting a crop, found it made quality table wine, quite unlike the foxy Concord and Scuppermund varieties. Leading British wine writer Jancis Robinson says Norton produces some of the finest red wines made anywhere from non-vinifera or European varieties. 50 years after Norton's grape was introduced, the Monticello Wine Company was founded in Charlottesville in 1873, and its Virginia Claret, based on the Norton grape, went on to win many awards nationally and internationally. Whether Dr. Norton created a new grape or simply introduced a wild grape or accidental hybrid into commercial cultivation, his contribution to American wine is gigantic. The hardiness and disease resistance of the Norton, combined with flavors that were much better than those found in Concord and the other members of the Vitis labrusca family, meant a viable Native American wine industry was possible from the shores of the Chesapeake Bay to the Missouri River, although it won't ripen much farther north than the Mason-Dixon one. Unfortunately, just as the promise of quality commercial Virginia viticulture was being realized, Prohibition took hold there in 1914. The vineyards were abandoned or grubbed up, and only a few documents, photographs, and the occasional bottle remained of the era. Unfortunately, settlers carried the Norton vine cuttings west, where it found a grateful home in Missouri and Arkansas, and cuttings from old vines revived the grape industry in those states. Eventually, Norton was reintroduced to its native Virginia by Dennis Horton of Horton Vineyards in the early 1990s. Now, many Virginia wineries produce in Norton. Evidence of Norton's revival in Virginia is how quickly some wineries sell out of it, and how the price has climbed over $20 in several wineries. Some charging as much as $50 a bottle and selling out. Now, I seem to be missing some pages to this script. I apologize. My mother was in the emergency room, and it was quite a rush to get this together. But let's see, so that's the 19th century. 20th century. Basically nothing until 1967. Two small farm wineries were started around Middleburg, Farfaloo and Meredith Vineyards. Both are now defunct. They were growing French hybrids, which had been pioneered by a man named Philip Wagner, who had a vineyard called Horty Vineyards in Maryland. The French hybrids were developed as an answer to the phylloxera crisis in Europe, where their vineyards were wiped out by our vine louse that came over there on infected American cuttings. So one of the ideas was to crossbreed Native American and the European Vitis vinifera. Some of you may know, crossbreeding is a very time-consuming process, and they ended up with some grape varieties that did indeed have American hardiness, but were considered to produce inferior wine by the French. However, Wagner and Horty said these grapes will make a commercial viticulture possible on the East Coast because it will make good, reliable table wine, maybe not Chambertin, but marketable, serviceable, and resistant to both cold and fungal diseases. So French hybrids were planted in the 60s and 70s. Finally, people found out a man named Dr. Constantine Franck. Anybody from upstate New York? Constantine Franck, does that ring a bell at all? Okay. Of Dr. Frank's vinifera cellars in Hammondsport on Cuca Lake. That was the center of the northern wine industry in the Finger Lakes. Well, he was a Russian immigrant, came from the Ukraine, and he was also a plant scientist. And he knew that certain varieties of Vitis vinifera would survive the Ukrainian winters, and if they could take that, then they could survive upstate New York. Unfortunately for him, he spoke bad English, and he went to Cornell to try to talk them into doing this and try to tell him he was a scientist. This was in the 1950s. They thought he was a nut. The only job they gave him at Cornell was being a janitor. He said basically, show them. So he did. He experimented with a Frenchman named Charles Fournier, who together they found some favorable vineyard sites in the Finger Lakes where they could plant Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, two European grape varieties used in Champagne. And he proved that they could survive the winter and produce fruit. He then planted the Russian grape, Rakatsatelli, on his own vineyard site on Cuba Lake, and it survived and produced wine, and he went on to produce the first vinifera wines in the eastern United States. Since then, and with the growth of viticultural knowledge at Cornell and Virginia with Virginia Tech, the planting of the European grape varieties has spread. However, we've also learned that because of our challenges of cold winters, high humidity and fungal diseases, it matters a lot what you plant where. In California, they can get away with doing almost anything because it's a paradise for the vine. But in the East, it's a very heartbreaking process if you don't do careful research. Now, there's 30 years of research that people coming into the industry can learn from that, of course, Jefferson and his people didn't have for all the hard work they did. So the 1980s into the 90s was learning what to plant where. And then in the 2000s, when you finally got a critical mass of people who knew what they were doing, didn't just want to be gentlemen farmers, planting the wrong grapes in the wrong place, suddenly Virginia wine really took off. 1998, 2001, if you can find any, great vintages of Virginia wine, still ahead of Merlot. 2001, last week, it was too young, still. It doesn't often happen, but so we were at the point where we're producing world-class wines. The And the question is, how do you get that economically sustainable? How do you get the word out? How do you raise the reputation of Virginia wine? Because quite frankly, most of you are thankfully too young to remember the bad wines we used to have to suffer with when Mrs. Rogan, who owned the Oak Crop Vineyards, also owned the Horse Head Inn, and so they had to serve their wines. By the time she retired a few years ago, her wines were very good, but at the time, in the late 80s or 90s, they were not so good, and so this helped spread a bad reputation for Virginia wine. So a lot of people still haven't gotten to know that, but I also want to give you incentive for lasting through this presentation to say that I brought some samples of today's Virginia wine with me, so you can make your own empirical analysis, as Jefferson was a great empiricist to see for yourselves. So what grapevines do we have here that do well in Virginia? At first, people planted a lot of Chardonnay and Cabernet. We've since found out that even though it's warm, Cabernet Sauvignon has issues that probably have to do a lot with soil hydrology. The grapevine, if you look at it, goes down as deep as 30 feet below the surface. So most of what happens for that plant is below the surface. The French know this, but for Americans, everything is kind of, we don't have centuries of their experience. So Cabernet doesn't do well in Virginia except in the right place in the right years. So people gradually started moving to Cabernet Franc. The Cabernet Franc is one of the Bordeaux grapes. It's also grown in the Loire Valley in the Chillon district. It metabolizes well on clay soils. It's the cold hardiest of the red Bordeaux varieties, and it does better in most years, especially wet years, than Cabernet Sauvignon. So we've got some empiricism with some decades of this. Chardonnay does actually very well in Virginia as wine, as a grapevine. It's terrible. That's susceptible to any disease you can think of, but whatever comes off the vines that people can make wine from is pretty good. I'm not a Chardonnay fan in general, but Virginia Chardonnay is some of the best. Can anyone name the white grape variety that's made Virginia famous since 1990 or 93? It's a European white grape, and it's pretty obscure. It's not what we call international pride. It's called Viognier. It's that hard to pronounce word that starts with V, V-I-O-G-N-I-E-R. Viognier. It's a Viognier, and it's from the northern Rhone. The grape almost went out of commercial existence in the 1980s, but Dennis Horton at Horton Vineyards planted it. He's a very experimental, empiricist kind of guy, and he noticed it and was much better at resisting rot than Chardonnay was. And he knew that if you were going to be successful in Virginia, you had to be planting grape varieties that would survive the wet season and still be able to ripen fruit and bring in clean fruit into the winery. So he planted the Viognier, and he went, his 92 was the first vintage, and he went to California. There was a group called the Rhone Rangers, who were people who planted Rhone grape varieties, and this was one of them. They all wanted to find out how to do Viognier, and he brought his Viognier, and this was, I think, the 93 vintage, which won more awards for Viognier than any other Viognier in the country at that time. And he said, how did I do, guys? And Dick Arrowwood said, well, frankly, notice you cleaned our clocks. This is better than anything we got. So he knew that this was the right grape in the right place that could be relied on. And since his start, that has become the trendiest grape in Virginia. In a way, even though we make great Chardonnay, hardly anyone knows it because all the focus is on Viognier, which we do well, and hardly anyone else does well. It's a very difficult grape like Riesling to do well. It requires a certain climate and a certain set of circumstances. The other grape we do well, as I mentioned, is Cabernet Franc for reds. It's not as tannic as Cabernet, and maybe that's good because most of the wine consumers, like most of the people in this room, are women, and women tend not to like very tannic reds. Also, tannin takes a long time to mature, so you want a red that's approachable, dry but approachable, and has some sense of style like a Bordeaux red does. That's Cabernet Franc. Merlot also does very well here, but it's not cold hardy, which can be a problem. So in the 2000s, we also got into the next phase of the Virginia Revolution, which was looking at grape varieties that we hadn't done before. Tony Wolfe and Bruce Onquin at Virginia Tech are spending a lot of time looking at what works well in Virginia. So they suggested some new grape varieties that we hadn't thought of before. They're from Europe, but they're very obscure. Tamat is from the south of France, but it's where the word tannin comes from. It's a very tannic grape variety. And they said, well, let's take it and add it to some Cabernet Franc, which doesn't have much tannin. It that'll make a better wine. Petit Manseng, that's a very obscure group, comes from the Jefferson in France. It's very fruity, like tropical aromatic fruity, like a muscat, but it has very high acid. The main thing about Virginia is that it has thick skins, so it will not rot, even in a wet season, and it will then allow the grapes to ripen without being degraded by fungal disease, which is a very good thing. So, and the nice thing too is it makes a very marketable wine. People like a fruity wine, but at the same time it has the balance and acidity that you don't have to put bags of tartrate in and spend money for in the winery. So we have a wine industry today that has a nice diversified span. So we have our glamour grape varieties, or Viognier, Chardonnay, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Petit Manseng, maybe some Tannat. People are even doing Touriga, which is the great grape of port in Portugal, but that's about the worst grape for fungal diseases. Every time I taste one, I ask them, where did you get it? Oh, they ripped it up. The vineyard's gone. So there's less and less of it now. So it might become valuable just by being scarce. But we're learning. Like every other region, the east coast of America is the last, anything east of the Rockies is the last frontier of the wine world. So everybody out here is a pioneer trying to find what's going to survive against fungal diseases, make quality wine, and make a vineyard economy that the grower can rely on as economically sustainable year to year. And it's also about environmentally sustainable, because if you don't have to spray, that means less chemical synthetics going into the environment. So that gets us right back to Norton. So Norton, which is part native, part accidental hybrid, we think, does wonderfully here. If you haven't had it, you've got to try it, and then tell people, well, from Virginia, I've had Norton. It's our specialty. They make it in Missouri, but it's a Virginia original. I wish I had some, but I've drunk it all, so no. And it's hard to get an inexpensive one now. I mean, Horton makes a very good, kind of reliable commercial grade, but you can go up from there. But it's not going to be inexpensive because the plantings are growing, but people are buying it up. It's fun, it's different, it's popular. You may like it, you may not, but I'd recommend trying it with food before you give up. And you heard it here first, the best match for Norton is something like Chinese dumplings or wushu. The wushu sauce, the holy sauce. That's totally the best thing for Norton. You can say, this is great wine food pairing. Let's see. So I will now move into speeding up here. Okay. I'm running out of breath, and I know we're running out of time. New developments and a glimpse into the future. So I'm bringing you up with development of the industry. So Virginia has seen a practical doubling of the number of bonded vineyards and bonded wineries in the last 4 years. International critics have heaped high praise on the state's wines, and major medals in international competitions have been brought back to the Commonwealth. There's a growing professionalism among the international cadre of experienced winemakers who are fine-tuning Virginia's viticulture. There's also a growing awareness across the wine media that the industry is making serious wine, from world-class Viognier to red Bordeaux blends, often led by Cabernet Franc and Petit Verdot. That's what I forgot to mention, Petit Verdot. How many of you ever heard of Petit Verdot? Those of you who've been drinking probably longer than the rest, yes. Good for you, yeah. That is and did you hear about it where? In France or Virginia? Yeah.
From my parents.
Where do they, where now? Because it's an obscure grape.
My dad just does.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, it's one of the 5 Bordeaux grapes. Probably it's like, Neptune or Uranus. It's one of those planets. It's way out there where you just don't think about it a whole lot. Although Carbonara is Pluto, but that's a different story. So Petit Verdot, it's grown as a blending grape, and we found that it makes fantastic wine on its own in Virginia, especially in certain vintages. And they really can't do that in California or Australia the same way. It's too hot. Here it needs the heat, but not as intense as they get in California. So we get red Bordeaux blends, and the Meritage is what they call but you have to pay for it to call it Meritage. So you get a Bordeaux blend in Virginia. It could be anything with 2 or more red Bordeaux grapes. So the 2 Cabernets, Merlot, Petit Verdot, and Malbec. Those are the red Bordeaux grapes. But Petit Verdot increasingly is giving us a real regional distinction of something that has lots of finesse, lots of smooth, ripe tannins, and some sage and lavender and spicy kind of damson plum. So it's a very stylish grape, and it's making a very different kind of wine. So whether you're going from Viognier to Petit Verdot, we're getting out of the usual things. And then we also have varieties like Albarino, Petit Manseng, as well as French hybrids like Jefferson and Vidal that have been around for 20 more years. So medals and critical accolades are nice, but the most important praise is that Virginia wine sales continue to grow. In-state sales of Virginia wines increased nearly 7.5% from 2008 to 9 despite the recession. That's twice the national average of increased consumption for wine of any kind. In fiscal year 2010, total Virginia wine sales were up 13% over the year before. In October 2010, a feature-length documentary on Virginia wine called Vintage, The Winemaker's Year by Silverthorne Films premiered on public TV stations in Virginia and across the nation. Instead of being a glitzy tourist promotional, the film is a frank, informative, detailed, and unromantic examination of the challenges and rewards of making wine in Virginia's climate. The documentary starts with a dormant winter pruning in 2008 and follows the winemakers of the Monticello appellation throughout the season up to harvest and beyond. The film was shot mostly in vineyards with an emphasis on showing the entire process from grape and vine evolution to crush and winemaking. The film concludes with a wine tasting in February 2009 at the Virginia Wine Expo in Richmond. Another measure of the professionalism of the Virginia wine industry is its attitude towards sustainability and the environment. New Kent Vineyards is perhaps the most representative of this trend, but there are others. Northgate Vineyard in Loudoun County opened in 2011 with a gold level LEED, that's Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, certified tasting room. Cooper Vineyards in Louisa recently opened a redesigned tasting room with a platinum LEED certification. Sunset Hills Vineyard, with the largest solar energy system in Loudoun County, bills itself as turning sunshine into wine. Ducard Vineyards near Old Rag Mountain in Madison County uses solar panels to generate all the electricity they use for their tasting room, and like many wineries, they used reclaimed hardwoods in the construction of their facility. An activity at Ducard that is becoming increasingly popular at Virginia wineries near major hiking trails is hiking, where people with an interest in both hiking and wine seek out wineries near hiking trails. Ducard lies at the eastern edge of the Shenandoah National Park, in the shadow of Old Rag Mountain and White Oak Canyon, with hiking access from the winery. It's actually wrong, it's nearby the winery. And it participates in neighboring Sharp Rock Vineyards in the Foothills Scenic Wine Trail. Delphos Vineyards in Nelson County also touts its hiking trails and the many acres of forest on the property. In 2001, the 75th anniversary of the creation of the Shenandoah National Park at Skyline Drive by FDR, there was growing interest in combining visits to the park with visits to nearby wineries. And groups as diverse as Wine Hiking Club of Central Virginia to the Outdoor Afro are combining hiking and tasting at nearby wineries. As Annette Boyd of the Virginia Wine Marketing Office says, Virginia wines have reached an important turning point. Thanks to the reluctance of most wine distributors to take on regional U.S. wines, gaining market share in the United States outside the state is still a major challenge. But thanks to the change in attitude across the spectrum of the wine media, from bloggers and leading English wine writers to the Wine Spectator, and the high quality of today's Virginia wines, that is more likely now than ever before. Great quality is the most important feature governing wine quality, emphasizes Virginia's enologist, Dr. Bruce Auckland, who is now Emeritus Professor at Virginia Tech's Department of Food Science and Technology. Tom Payette is a consultant winemaker based in Rapidan, Virginia, with over 25 years of winemaking experience. What impresses him most about Virginia wines today compared to 10 years ago is our ability to build on our existing knowledge. We were able to grow better and better grapes, and that is what the key asset to fine wine. Better clones and better wine growing practices have combined and elevated us greatly. Payette believes Virginia will be recognized for our wine quality foremost, and then for varietal strengths like Cabernet and Viognier. I undoubtedly feel we compete with other wine-producing regions around the world because we have balanced, well-made wines distinct to our region. So coming back to Monticello to conclude, on a clear, crisp autumn day in early November 2011, I drive up through the normally closed gates of what Jefferson named Montalto, the larger, taller mountain to the southwest that dwarfs Monticello, twisting up narrow, steep road to arrive at the summit. The dramatic remains of the geologic collision of the African and North American tectonic plates that formed the Appalachian Mountains some 480 million years ago. To the south is the placid lower Piedmont. To the west, the Blue Ridge Mountains, shining in the late afternoon sun. To north, the city of Charlottesville. I approach a cluster of about 20 people standing near a very large tractor with a 20-foot hinged arm. Several rows of neat parallel trenches are punctuated by galvanized steel posts. The occasion is the first planting of grapevines on Mont Alto, a collaborative effort between the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which owns Mont Alto and Monticello, and Piedmont, Virginia Community College, which will use the vineyard for vocational training for its viticulture and enology workforce services training program. The group are students from the program at PBCC, dressed for vineyard work, each with a shovel. Presiding over the planting and lesson in vineyard layout are a pair we've met before. I skipped the part where you met this one guy. Oliver Osberger of Wine and Vine Care and Gabriele Rossi. If Virginia had a Grand Cru vineyard system, as they do in Burgundy, this would be it. 35 years after helping establish Barboursville vineyards nearby, and through his grafting work, many other Virginia vineyards in the following decade, Rossi is helping the students ensure quality Virginia viticulture continues into the 21st century on a world-class site, originally owned by Jefferson himself. And the grape being planted? Pinot Noir, one that Jefferson appreciated while visiting Burgundy and had planted at his Monticello vineyard, and which Rossi points out can be made as a dry rosé, a sparkling blanc de noir, a fruity or complex oak-aged dry red. While the 2011 vintage was not nearly as fine as the 2010, Jefferson would be very proud to know that the famous red grape of Burgundy, which he had enjoyed, was being planted under expert guidance on a Grand Cru site he had owned in his lifetime, and that the patient science of viticulture would continue henceforth in Virginia, and that the Virginia wine industry is continued experimentation was like his own efforts at Monticello, continuing to redesign, tear down, and rebuild until the end of his life. Thank you. I'll be happy to take some questions, and I'd like to ask Mr. Leahy to take a picture with me. I do also have some stats in here. Anyone who wants to know what our statistics are, and maybe a highlight of fungal diseases for any of you who want to start your own vineyard and be scared out of the process. Run away! So I can just tell you that off the top, Virginia ranks 6th among American states by wine production by volume of wine grapes. There are about 200 operating farm wineries across the state. There are about 3,000 acres of vineyards, commercial grapevine vineyards, with close to 90% already bearing fruit. Over 50% of Virginia wineries are located in the upper Piedmont, east of the Blue Ridge Mountains, between Nelson County and the Maryland state line. The average price per ton for wine grapes in 2010 was $1,700 per ton. The Virginia grape and wine industry has a total economic impact of more than $362 million per year. That figure is actually now outdated on my website. I just got new statistics from the Virginia Wine Marketing Office. It's gone up. It's doubled, more than doubled in the last 5 years. So it's making a huge contribution to the state economy, not just the economy, but to rural economy and to Virginia agriculture. It's one of, if not the most profitable sector of Virginia agriculture. And it's not just in profit for commodity, it's value added, because you take the product that's grapes, you make it into fine wine, and then the price of the final product is very value added. And if you've ever been to the wineries, the real value that Virginia wine offers isn't the product on the shelf, but it's tasting the product at the source, next to the vineyard, in our beautiful Virginia countryside. So agritourism is a huge part of what makes this a memorable experience for people who come from all over the world and take the Virginia wine back with them and remember it fondly. So at this point, any questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you again for coming to speak to us. I really enjoyed it. I just mentioned to you quickly at dinner, you said that you thought Trump Vineyards or Trump's new vineyard that he has in Virginia would add a lot to the Virginia wine industry. I wish you could expand on that a little bit and say how you think his vineyard will affect the Virginia wine industry.
Okay, his vineyard is not long ago, this vineyard was about 10% of the entire fine wine grape acreage in Virginia. So, you know, whether at that point, for better or worse, whatever happened to the Columbia State Vineyard Winery operation would have a larger than life impact on how the industry was perceived, especially outside the state. And with the notoriety of the previous owner, you know, that wasn't necessarily a good thing.